You're listening to the Road to Wisdom podcast, weaving stories told by wonderful minds about all things motherhood, health, intimacy, politics, nature, and everything in between.
Join us on an adventure discovering unique experiences that we can learn from to enhance the ways in which we live.
We are your hosts, Chloe
and Keshia. Welcome to the Road to Wisdom podcast. Today we have Eliza Mondegreen on the show. Eliza is a graduate student in mental health, and she has been predominantly looking at online transgender and detransition communities. Is that correct? You've also had some experience attending gender affirming care conferences, which we are really interested in getting into. But I guess today, one of the main things we have you on, Eliza, is because Chloe and I have a few children between us, and it's a very different world. Our children are growing up in a very, very different world to what we grew up in. And I guess I've heard you speak before and how you can draw quite a few similarities between certain, certain cases we would have seen growing up, and like, how would I phrase this correctly?
Do you like when we grew up, we went through like natural phases of?
No, like we still saw things like bulimia would be around the school and anorexia and like these kind of issues, that depression still happened. But I feel like the landscape's changed somewhat significantly, and we're seeing those kind of like people who would have fallen into those cohorts maybe falling into something else now that is quite novel still, I would say, for us anyway, here in Australia. But I guess we wanted to get you on just to understand it a little bit better, and because you are quite well versed in I guess all of this information, we couldn't think of anyone better to speak to. So welcome, Eliza. Thank you for coming on.
It's really a pleasure to be here. And this is the first time I'm ever recording a podcast where it's already tomorrow where you are. So that's fun.
Welcome to the future.
I know. And when when we release it, it'll also be tomorrow
in the future.
Yeah.
Fun times. It actually gets really fun when we have to organize the time difference and daylight savings versus not. It's been a real joy.
Yeah, I bet.
So I guess where we would love to start, Eliza, is basically how you got into finding these communities and researching them.
Sure. I mean, I, like a lot of people, I was very curious to see that there was this kind of like new something that was dressed up as a civil rights movement that was kind of moving around the edge of my like volunteer and professional opportunities. And it also was starting to kind of leak into my, my social circles, my friendships. And I was just really curious, like, okay, well, what is going on with gender? I was working in a, progressive public nonprofit. I had friends who became, very, very enthralled with kind of the new ideas about sex and gender that were going around. And when I wanted to understand those things, I went to the library, but I also went online and was just, I wanted to understand what people were saying about their experiences of coming to identify as transgender and deciding to transition. And this seemed like the introvert's way to do that. And the more time that I spent in these communities, the more it was like, okay, this is a really interesting, from like a kind of an anthropological perspective, that you're like learning about this new local culture and what are its norms and what are its taboos and what are its like expectations and trajectories. And I ultimately decided when I went back to grad school that was what I wanted to study, because I felt like it was really poorly understood. Both by the wider culture, but also by like I think it's pretty poorly understood by the clinicians who work with these patients. So that was a big motivation for me, was to just try to bring what's happening online out and, translate it into basic English that hopefully everybody can understand and hopefully it's useful.
Yeah. And like, just to add, a lot of clinicians are our age and older. Like, you're not getting young clinicians going into these practices who have grown up with these online communities that can get quite out of hand. And I guess we see it a little bit in social media, but I have only heard about how like the chat, like group chats and those kind of meeting places for people to converse and share their stories. And I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of positives in that as well, depending on the group. But yeah, how negative it can get. And I don't know, like we didn't grow up with that. So I'm just guessing that most of the people who would be treating for gender dysphoria also haven't done that research.
Yeah, I mean, there is something of a generational divide. Like, I definitely grew up with like the between most clinicians, and I think where most of the patients are these days. So I didn't grow up with the kind of online identity communities that we see now, and that we see not just with trans, but with so many different kind of diagnoses and ways of relating to the world. But I definitely grew up with like the online Harry Potter fandom, which gave me a taste of just how fanatical and like all engrossing those communities can be, and the kinds of needs that they seem to serve for people who might otherwise be pretty isolated, or maybe they just struggle to fit in offline.
Yeah. And so when you jumped into gender studies, or more or less having a look at these online transgender communities, what were the main things that you were seeing?
So I was really interested. I wanted to see what kinds of evidence young people would use to say that they were trans. Like, what did they think? What evidence did they find in their own lives that was like, okay, this is the basis for this kind of radical re-understanding of who I am and what my place is in the world. And I think one of the first things that struck me was how familiar the things that these girls and young women were talking about were. So they're talking about, okay, I knew that I wasn't a girl or a woman. And by the way, they say that much more often than they say, like, I knew that I was a boy or a man, although some people also say those things. But it's much more like negatively framed. It's like, okay, I knew I wasn't a woman or a girl. And it's like, it was because I really hated my period, or I last felt comfortable with my body when I was 8 or 9 years old, and then puberty started. And, they would talk about hating their breasts and hating being objectified and feeling really uncomfortable with things that I think just about any girl would feel pretty uncomfortable with.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to really not liking parts of our bodies at that time because it is so new, and usually it is awkward, and usually you don't feel great.
No, you're changing and everything's changing, and the way people look at you changes. And it brings on a whole range of different emotions, and I guess you start questioning. You could easily question it as a girl. Anyone.
Yeah, it just seemed like the most normal female experiences were being mobilized as evidence that, you're really a boy, you're really a man, you should really transition. And before I had gotten interested in these communities, before I had really looked into it, there were a lot of things that I was maybe prepared to kind of passively assume. And one of those things was that, okay, these people are having a really, really different experience that I just know nothing about. And that was one of the first things that was disproved by just going online and reading all of these like testimonials. It's like, I know exactly what that feeling is.
Yeah. And you relate that back to your own, like, growing up. I mean, I guess we can all relate to growing up and feeling that way, especially as women.
Especially as women.
Yeah.
Like, I think, growing up as a boy has its own challenges for sure. And there are people who are much better suited to speak to that. But like, it is when your body all of a sudden is, it's changing, and it means all of these different things all of a sudden to all of these different people who all have an opinion about how you look and what you should do with your body. Like, this is a very like difficult passage, I think.
Yeah.
And it's being hijacked.
And now what I feel is happening is that instead of teenage girls getting support through that and like sharing their experience and realizing, like, if you talk to mom, she probably had the same experience. If you talk to grandma, she probably had the same experience. But now I guess there's a lot of seeking within peers, and you've got this new novel thing that could just make it go away or fix it. And there's a lot of celebration also if you choose that path. So there's a lot of, it's very enticing.
I'd be really curious to know if that's a common theme. I mean, it feels like we're obviously incredibly dissociated from our bodies more and more and more, although there is I feel there is a slow returning to kind of really claiming our womanhood. But it definitely feels like there's so much dissociation still from such a young age. And to be celebrated as a person who feels isolated, or a person who feels like they're really not enjoying themselves or their bodies and they don't have any support, like the family unit, we've talked about this many times, like the family unit just being completely, melted to the ground and non-existent. It would not be hard to turn to online communities and feel so validated and, so do you think do you see that happening on the online space?
Yeah, I mean, I think that adolescents have probably always had a tendency to turn toward their peers, and that's just part of kind of growing up and sorting out your identity. I think that the kind of like generational fractures have gotten maybe wider because of, technology. And like, if you're a young person today, you really are growing up in a very different world than the one that even your parents grew up in. And these young people have been set loose on the internet, which has some awfully dark corners. And it's a place that, most adults don't understand. And I think that we haven't even begun to reckon with the ways that like these experiences of like online disembodiment and disembodied social interactions and, representing yourself in a video game or representing yourself by an avatar and always, seeing yourself through a filter, like all of the ways that this can maybe change the way that we relate to our body, probably on some like very deep level.
Yeah.
And that it probably, I think it encourages something that humans are very prone to anyway, which is to say like, okay, well, I have this real self that's kind of, it's inside there somewhere and somehow people can't really see it. And maybe my body doesn't always represent it or people misinterpret it. And online there is this idea that, you can curate yourself so closely, so carefully, that maybe you can bring that self into being and into being recognized. And that somehow this kind of spilled out from online and became a problem of, schools and medicine and education, like all of these different things.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, I guess, coming from more of an emotional, like, parent role in all of this. I mean, we have babies and we're told, well, at least in the world that we run our circles in, that babies are born perfect. Like when a baby comes out, the way that they interact with you, the way that you, like, they will indicate if they need a feed. They will indicate if they've done a shit. They're born perfect. And, all you need to do is like have them close to you, or if they need to cry, then that's actually like a physiological need and you just need to be there to support them. Things like that. And then to go from like, oh my God, like we've got these perfect babies at our bodies, which like, personally, I didn't completely love my body until I became a mother. Like I didn't understand the function of my body fully and deeply until I birthed my baby, and I was like, oh my God, this is what it's all for.
Yeah.
and then you've got this like perfect little like tiny human. You're like, oh my God, you're perfect. Like everything about you is perfect. And that's something that I drill into my children constantly. Doesn't matter what you like, doesn't matter what you wear, doesn't matter like what you enjoy, what your hobbies are, what you're good at, what you're not. Like you're absolutely perfect. And then to go from that and then see all these children, like they're still children, and they're like, no, there's something wrong with me. Like, so much so I was born into the wrong body. It's just like there's such conflicting
because there's
ideas.
these parents who are like, what's the harm? I'd rather have a trans child than a dead child, which I really don't like reading because it seems really I don't even have the word for it.
It takes the nuance out of it. Like, they're your only option.
But as a parent, you just accept that there's a fault. There's something wrong with your child, and you support that, and you'll do whatever it takes to change that. But I'd love to know about, or kind of hear from you about what's inside communities in terms of like the dialogue with people's, because I know you've spoken a lot about doubt and how that translates in the communities. What do you see? What's the dialogue like in terms of people doubting themselves or not being sure?
Yeah, I would say that like the subtext of these communities is doubt that is never exhausted and never resolved. And the ways that that is handled, because it's a very sensitive subject, are interesting. It's like basically when you have something that is taboo, the whole idea is that you have this like package that you put around it, and it's like it's how you deal with it within the community. So for doubt is really, in a lot of ways, it's pathologized within online trans communities. So if somebody is feeling a doubt, like I'm not sure that this is the right idea, or I'm not sure I'm really transgender, or something like that, or it seems like things are getting worse since I transitioned, like these are all things that you would see every day in these communities. Just the most absolutely serious, basic, pervasive doubts. And people will air these, and then they'll say like, but this is just my internalized transphobia, right? And the community's role is basically to say, yes, this is just your internalized transphobia. And when you overcome that, which you have responsibility to do because it hurts you and it hurts the community, it hurts other trans people, then you'll feel better. Or that you have a responsibility to yourself to kind of like to take the next step, and then things will be better. Or that if you feel like an imposter, it's not because you're pretending to be something that you're not, which should always be the most parsimonious explanation. It's because you have, imposter syndrome. And that's something that you need to get over. It's not something that you need to explore. It's not something you need to take seriously. It's something you need to get rid of.
Wow.
And they'll talk about it as, there'll be intrusive thoughts is a really common way to talk about doubt. Like it's an OCD fixation to wonder, to say, well, am I really a man, or is this really working?
Yeah. And just for a little bit of clarity, Eliza. So, I mean,
Sure.
I know that you've gone more into the women transitioning to men circles. So when you see these women, trans men,
Yeah.
I'm going to get this wrong, and I'm not trying to offend anyone, but I will accidentally get it wrong. So when you see these women come into this space, have they already begun the process of transitioning to men, or are they coming in to kind of suss out where they're at and if that is the right path for them, or are they already there and they're just talking about that end of transition, like, I guess, emotion and experience?
Yeah. People seem to join when they're questioning, and then they stay. So these communities are an easy place to end up when if you're a young person today, like you're going to be, chances are good, you're going to be prompted very often to identify yourself with gender. And if you have, a personality or, kind of progressivist politics or all of these different things, you're going to be prompted to identify yourself as like transgender. And then you're going to go online to figure out, am I really trans? What does that mean? What do I do? Why do I feel this way? Are other people there who feel this way? And that's really the stage that I see people kind of entering and getting socialized into these communities is, as they are kind of test driving and solidifying those identities.
Wow. It seems like I don't want to say the word trap because it's not the right word, but it feels like once you enter, there's no way to get out.
And then, so, I mean, if you look at Abigail Schreier's work, she spoke a lot on like the social contagion of these concepts. And again, I think she focused on teenage girls. But like, imagine being, and we're seeing this come to Australia, and I did mention this before we jumped online. Parents who won't assign their child a gender. And so you've got like, so rather than even just waiting until adolescence, where, I mean, and we've spoken about this with Isabella Melbourne, where like, you go through these changes, and like, I mean, I talked about my personal experience of my boobs were growing at different rates each one, and I would wear oversized baggy t-shirts, and I noticed my body changing, so I bought boys' boardies, and like I'd wear my dad's t-shirts and caps, and like just keep it locked down because I was freaking out, and I was like, no, I'm still sporty, and I'm not doing girly things, and I refuse to wear bathers and all of this stuff. And I like that, I can kind of conceptualize how you would go from those feelings and like then like the raging hormones that are just coming in and out, and feeling confused, and then going online, and perhaps I feel like had I grown up in a different time, I would have fallen into that.
Well, that's the tragedy, right?
Yeah,
it's so tragic that we don't just normalize how hard puberty is. We've given another option of like, it's not normal. And there's probably a mistake. And you can
now imagine this landscape where we've got children growing up, and they're not like their
they've
parents
never been
are
told
waiting
they're perfect as well
to tell them what their pronouns are.
Right.
And like
no, that seems like such a total abdication of like parental responsibility.
Oh, thank you. Very well said. But it is just, it's mind-blowing because, I mean, you've already got this issue it's huge and it's scary, and like that's something that, we feel like as parents we're going to have to navigate with our kids as they go through adolescence, and this is why we really want a front foot on this. But if our kids are growing up with other kids who are like, I don't know what I am, like how dissociated is your body then, or how disassociated are you from your body then, when you can't even identify, or no one will identify you? Like, is that anyways, it's wild world out there.
It's really wild. And I think that you're touching on something which is like, okay, you can raise your own kids in contact with the reality of their sex, and also be like, you have a sex and you have a personality, and you can have, whatever kind of personality you want and whatever kind of interests, and kids are going to have, toy and game and playmate and fictional character preferences, and adults are the ones who load those with, meaning, not kids. But even if you're really careful with your own children, like you're touching on the problem of, okay, what happens when kids are growing up in an environment where other adults are confusing children? And, it would have to be disorienting to be a small child and to have kids in your class where, that they're a boy, or that they're a girl, but nobody's supposed to say.
Yeah.
It affects, I think one of the major fallacies of the way that kind of trans activism has pushed this idea of trans rights is that it doesn't affect anybody else. But of course it affects everybody else when there is, this expectation to pretend that's kind of put at the heart of like your social interactions or your education. I'm really worried about that. And I just want to touch on something that, you said you didn't want to call it a trap. I would call it a trap. Like, I would definitely call it a trap that, like, it's like when you take these beliefs about sex and gender on board, that if you have a certain kind of personality or certain interests or certain discomforts, that is something that determines who you really are, and not your body. Like as soon as you believe that, you are going to be some kind of transgender, because nobody has the experience of perfect fit with like their sex and their sexuality and their sex role and the way that everybody else sees them. Everybody is going to chafe against that in some way. Like it really does set up almost every kid to have this experience of what they're going to call gender dysphoria, if this is what they're being taught from a really young age.
Yeah, it's so confusing. And I wonder, like I've had a grown up interact with me and say to my baby, I don't know how it happened, but basically she said, called my baby a they. And I was like, no, it's a boy. But I wonder how, as a baby who probably isn't listening or, isn't really connecting with her in the first place, how detrimental that can be. So our school age children, if they're being called they or them, as opposed to she or he, what could the damage be there? Like, what do you think?
I mean, it just seems a lot like this quicksand to me, where rather than giving kids solid factual information about their bodies and how their bodies work, we're giving them, this, well, you are whatever you think that you are, and whatever your ideas are right now, like, and whatever it means to be a boy is whatever you think that it means, and whatever it means to be a girl is whatever you think. Like, if we did this with any other subject other than sex, I think it'd be really obvious how much this confuses children just out of necessity. I mean, if we did like, okay, how do you mail a letter? And we were like, well, you mail a letter, however you want to mail a letter. And then it's mailed. And that's, like, it would be absolutely crazy making. This is not the way that we teach children about the world. But now it's the way that we teach children about sex.
Yeah. And you know what? In modern parenting, we actually do see that a lot, like even with just discipline. And we talk about this a lot. Like it's now just like, oh, discipline is whatever you think, like whatever you want it to be. It's just you discipline your way. And however that is for you and your family is the right way. And it's like, well, discipline's pretty black and white most of the time. Yeah. There's like abuse, of course. And then there's teaching your child to be safe and
giving them a correct moral compass,
exactly,
so that they can navigate the world as a half decent human being.
Yeah.
So how much of this do you think is just confusion within online communities and youth just really not knowing, or having had learnt about their bodies or having the support in their homes or, close connected families versus how politicalized and pushy are these concepts?
I'm not really sure how to answer that. Can you?
So I guess.
Sorry, can you?
No, that's okay. So I guess do you think inside online communities there's more like a genuine confusion because of the lack of support or knowledge or education within their homes or their schools versus the political picture? And it's obviously very big in America. Everyone's, celebrating and pushing this ideology. And I wonder, inside communities, do you think more people are just genuinely confused, or they're feeling like, oh, well, everybody is feeling this way, maybe I am too?
I guess like the kids that make it out alive, what are we seeing? Like, what are we seeing? Are there any is there any solid evidence backing like a child that makes it out, knowing who they are, being strong within their body, being like, this is my temple, I have to look after
like
this.
The ability to critically analyze inside these communities.
Like, this is what I got working with it versus this is wrong, I need to change it, fix it, slice it, chemical it, hormone it, and then I'll be accepted. And then, that, I guess, the mental state that goes along with that, where you kind of get sucked into that vortex of like doubt, and then someone affirms you and you're all good. Doubt, someone affirms you, doubt, someone affirms you, and you can just keep spiraling. Is there anything that you've seen that like we can do as parents to have the former child?
Yeah. So I've talked to a lot of parents and I've talked to a lot of people who've detransitioned. And there's not a formula. There's not something where it's like, okay, well, now the kid will be okay, or now they're not going to be affected by this. But I think there's a certain extent to which it's possible to like inoculate kids against any number of bad ideas, this being just one of them. And, that's talking about what they're going to run into at school, or, finding respectful ways to help kids navigate situations that are going to come up, when classmates are socially or medically transitioning, and being like, this child may be transitioning and we can use, their new name, and we can respect them as an individual and be kind to them. And they're not changing their sex, like this kind of like helping children to stay clear on reality, while also navigating social situations in which the incentives are on denying reality.
Yeah. Because it's such a hard, even that in and of itself as a parent, I'm like, that is so hard to navigate, because the idea that anyone can change their gender is more or less a fallacy. Like, you might think that you feel like the opposite sex, but you actually will never know that, because
how do you know?
You can't. You were born and you are what you were born, and that will be the way you experience life. So to then explain to a child, like, okay, so yeah, your friend was a girl and now wants to be a boy, or now, and so we're going to use these, we're going to use these
it's
pronouns.
Sticky. It's so sticky.
And it's really tough.
That's just something so hard for, like, kids are never getting enough. There's a lot. Like, the questions that my 8-year-old daughter asks me, I'm like, oh man, like, I'm exhausted. And this is just like simple, basic.
Like, where do fairies live?
Yeah.
You're like, I don't know.
Why
buddy.
doesn't my friend believe in unicorns? And I'm like, oh, we're not there yet. Like, but I've got. That is just big in and of itself. And then, add this whole other novel, like, social, somewhat bizarre situation on top of that. And it's really, it's going to get real sticky.
What do you think from a mental health standpoint, the consequences of this will be later on? I mean, I don't know if this is a true story or it was just clickbait, but I did see a gay couple who had a baby, obviously through surrogate, and when the baby was 2 years old, he was basically saying, we knew that he was a her because at 2 years old he was just having, or she or he was having the worst meltdowns and crying and angry and like all of these things. And so we knew that was probably what was happening. Like, so we changed. Gosh. Like when, and that's just skimming the surface of the story by a long shot. But what's going to happen for obviously, by the way, it's very normal for a 2-year-old to lose their shit. It's
right.
Like,
happens. I've never had a 2-year-old, but like I've met a 2-year-old
and they're pretty unstable. They're pretty unstable. Hey. And then also, that's obviously an extreme situation and version of this situation. But for, obviously you've exposed yourselves to the detransition community, and I have too, because I've always been incredibly curious about what's happening for these people, because they seem totally gaslit by their, the LGBT community, because they're suddenly like the enemy. And I follow a few folks who have detransitioned and they're having the hardest time. They are having extreme health conditions, from obviously all of the synthetic drugs that they've had to take, like a concoction daily, their surgeries, and then obviously their mental health on top of that. And so I just feel super concerned about the consequences of allowing this and pretending this is completely normal, normalizing it from such a young age, and then the onslaught of mental health concerns that are to follow.
Not even just mental health. Like I think if
society, it ripples out into society. Obviously, like it will be.
Yeah, but if this was an issue of purely mental health, I think we, we wouldn't, I say this with a grain of salt, but we wouldn't need to take it as seriously as, it's not just mental health. It's this like whole social contagion that's like created an industry where we're doing permanent medical damage to people. Like
totally. So it's a physiological and mental health problem.
And when you fall into this, into like if you jump on this train down this transition line as a kid, okay, well maybe it's a social transition, but then they grow up, and if they're continuously pushed into this or reaffirmed, even if they have doubts themselves, then they're taking synthetic hormones which have just an absolute obscene amount of possible side effects. Then they're changing their bodies and like medically changing their bodies. They're, castrating themselves there. And like, this is where it's like, you got to stop it earlier or make sure that you've got the right interventions in place early, or you're not pushing the wrong thing. Like I'm sure that there are people out there who do benefit from medical transition. I don't think it's as many as what we're seeing. And I think that, is proven by the number of people we're seeing detransition now. Or, I mean, I don't have the numbers on it and I've derailed the conversation a little bit. I apologize. But I was really curious, like once, like you said earlier, you can either have a trans child or a dead child. Well, like how many of these kids like have we stock taked what the suicide rates are pre, post, if they had, like do we actually have those numbers to be able to say lines like that?
So there has been very little good long-term research on most of the serious questions that come up about especially medicalizing kids. One thing that older research suggests is that suicide is still pretty rare. It's basically on par with, patients who have other serious mental health problems, which I think is the way to think about gender dysphoria and trans identity. And the other thing is that like that research has found that the suicide rate is pretty consistent across all of the stages of transition. So transition is sold as suicide prevention, and parents, like you said, have been, they're put in this terrible position where they're being presented with this false choice between, do you want a live child or a dead child? Like, of course, like your greatest fear is that something will happen to your kid. Of course you want a live child. But, the studies just don't support the idea that that's actually the choice. Like in the past, before this was really like culturally promoted, before it was really, everywhere in pop culture, before it was being taught in schools, the vast majority of kids who had much more organically developed this kind of distress and this kind of cross-sex identification, it resolved as they went through puberty and came to accept themselves and their bodies. And a lot of those kids were just gay. And now that we have this like massive cultural recruitment into this kind of distress and this kind of trans identification, I would expect, that if it weren't reinforced socially and then medically, that the detransition and desistance rates would be even higher, right? Because these aren't kids who came up with this idea, kind of on their own. These aren't kids who are highly gender nonconforming, who might come up with that idea, without it being suggested to them. These are kids who are having it suggested to them all the time.
Yeah. And not just by parents or family members. It's
and
like
not
the
just
culture
like
at large.
The culture at large. Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess that would kind of lead us down the road of the medicalization of these children. And even, I mean, I guess you've seen adults go down this path as well. And I mean, we've spoken about, we love to talk about the medical industry
in general.
And how we see the theme of, opening new industries and creating a problem that needs to be solved. There's a lot of cash that changes hands or exchanges
Mm-hmm.
hands in these processes, which I feel like, I mean, from my perspective, I feel like that is a very big incentive to go along with some of these really difficult
Well, you are literally being hooked up to synthetic drugs to give you an altered, like there's an adaptation, but it's not a real adaptation to your body. It's not like you take synthetic hormones to become a man. It's like an altered, adapted moment that needs to have a daily uptake to sustain itself. So, you know, and that's just taking hormones. That's not the tens of thousands of dollars of, you know, surgery to alter your body.
And I guess you've gone to some of these conferences, Eliza, where you've watched medical professionals speak on these issues. What have you seen there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, of course, like some forms of like distress can be induced, or some forms of like self-understanding can be tremendously lucrative for the medical industry. And that's definitely a big part of what we're seeing here. It's not all of it, but it's a huge contributor. So at this point, I've gone to a couple of different conferences of medical professionals who work in this area. And one of the things that there's a lot that's really interesting from going to these conferences. One of the things that was most interesting to me is people will talk very openly about kind of their own process of socialization into providing gender affirming care, and that this is a process of overcoming their own doubts about what they're doing and their own qualms about what they're doing. And so last year there was the World Professional Association of Transgender Health Conference in my city. There was a discussion about some things that are on the very contentious edge of transgender surgery. So things like nullification surgery, where you just cut everything off. Like basically like you look like a Ken doll or a Barbie, except you're not a Ken doll or a Barbie. Very, very disturbing surgeries. And there was a doctor who works, a plastic surgeon who works in San Francisco, who came to the microphone and was talking about how the first time he had a patient come in and request, you know, this kind of very extreme body modification, that the surgeon was really like disturbed and really not comfortable. And then the surgeon talks about how he overcame those feelings and came to realize that it was this like really essential part of gender affirming care, and it wasn't his place to judge it. And now he performs like a lot of those surgeries. So these conferences are full of those kinds of stories where like, I think the people telling them don't realize that it is a story about how you knew better and then you got over it.
So, yeah. And you're just like, so it's basically what I'm hearing a lot of here is that basically people have a gut intuition, like being part of the trans, like in one of those trans community forums and being like, oh, actually I have doubts that I do think I'm a man, which would be a very deep intuition. And then having yourself, like you gaslight yourself to be like, oh no, wait, that is just my inner transphobia, my internalized transphobia, which we're all born with. Apparently, this is why we need to introduce it into schools quite early, from what I hear. Right. And I just like, if I can, and it's almost like I can only prove that I'm not transphobic by doing these heinous surgeries
and becoming a full ally activist.
Yeah, changing my gender completely, or maybe going ahead with a surgery myself. And I don't know, I feel like if I went to a surgeon with a perfectly healthy arm that works perfectly well and provides me with all the things a second arm does, and was like, to take it off, I don't want it anymore, I don't identify with it anymore, and what I identify with, don't laugh, I'm serious.
She's really, this is her identity, okay? Like,
this
well,
is
you know what?
my
I want to be
identity.
a pirate.
And I don't want it. But like, I would be assessed. Like,
you'd be mentally
I'd be
unwell.
assessed. Yeah. And like,
you would think so.
Yeah, but I'm pretty like, oh God, I fucking hope so. That like a surgeon would be like, okay, I hear you, but you're gonna have to go through a whole plethora of assessments from psychotherapists and psychiatrists, and we need to see where your mental state is at because you can't reverse this.
Yeah.
You know, and it feels like, from what I've heard from the information that I've kind of got, which is, you know, bits here and there doesn't seem to be that kind of high quality critical thinking when it comes to gender affirming care, which is wild, because I mean, an arm is an arm, but
your
when
sex
it comes
organs
to
are also more important.
When it comes to your sex organs, they're not just providing you with hormones for the rest of your life that are going to increase your bone mass density, keep you running as your whole body is flooded with the hormones from your genitals. But you know, how can a child conceptualize having a family later in life? And that's taken off the table. And that's, I mean, I didn't think I'd ever have kids, and here I am pregnant with my fifth and bloody loving it. And I just didn't even feel like a whole person until I started creating a family. And I'm not saying that's for everyone, but like, how do you can't know that.
No, but if you had cut yourself off from that experience when you were a child, like that would have been a huge wrong.
Exactly. Like, and I mean, you hear about double mastectomies happening, and again, I know that there are women who have to go through that process, or they feel like they have to go through that process, but to have healthy mammary glands removed from your body, I don't understand how, as a surgeon or a medical professional, you're able to
money. It's the only logical
I mean, it's
answer.
money, but it's also, it's like, it's ideology. It's okay. What I wanted to understand when I was going to these conferences, what I'm still interested in understanding is, okay, when I look at a teenage girl who's going to a gender clinic and says she wants her breasts cut off and she wants to take testosterone, I see what I just said. I mean, I see a teenage girl who's going to a clinic and wants to have testosterone and get her breasts cut off, and that she probably, you know, I'm very curious about why she would want to do this. And it worries me. And that's what I see. And so I'm curious, like, okay, what do these providers see when that kid shows up in their exam room? And the answer is that they're not seeing what you and I, what the three of us are seeing. They are seeing the same vision that the patient is seeing, which is that there is this transgender alter that is kind of trapped inside, and which medical technology can let out. And that it's not just like a kind of a medical responsibility to the transgender alter to bring it into being, but it's also this, you know, it's this human rights crusade to do this. So they're literally, I think they are not seeing the patient who is in front of them. And they are not thinking about the human body as, you know, as you talked about, like as a holistic system where, you know, our reproductive organs are not just sources of hormones. They're not just used for baby making, like they're part of our whole bodies. Our uterus and our ovaries, you know, they protect us from dementia. There are all of these things that we don't understand about what we're messing with when we kind of give somebody a designer endocrine system. But these doctors have what I think Mary Harrington has characterized very well as this kind of like the same meat Lego mentality that their patients have, where it's like, well, you know, if you don't like your body, we can take this part out and we can put this part on. And there's not a respect for the human body as a very complex, very inadequately understood, very delicate organism.
And that actually, sorry, I feel like I'm hogging the mic here a little bit. Sorry, Chloe, but I'm so interested. But it kind of brings to light as well, because something that I did see growing up, I had friends getting breast implants. It was like the big thing. And, you know, I mean, we all know we live very close to Gold Coast. So most of the Gold Coast is Botoxed.
But most people who got breast implants have now realised a decade later that they've got breast implant illness and they need to get them removed.
Yes. But like not only that,
Who would have thought
so many women who did get breast implants or tummy tucks, or like sometimes there was a botchy job or it didn't work, but most of them still aren't happy with
who they are
or how they look. Like they get these surgeries, which are still surgeries. They're still dangerous. They still have, and they're still novel. And it's only just, in the last 5 or so years that we start hearing about breast implant illness. And thank you. Which, has been huge, but it's, I feel like surely, especially our plastic surgeons can look at that and be like, okay, so I changed this woman's body and it didn't help her mental state. Like I think in very rare moments, it helps the person's mental state and their love of their body. And surely you can like use your critical thinking and be like, so at least you can take, breast implants out. You can't sew a penis back on. Like it's just
right.
Like how anyway, it is, and it's really concerning that there are these conferences where there's like this mass gathering of affirming this gender affirming care. It's it's interesting. I think it's a really important note for everyone to take home because I mean we could extrapolate from this current scenario, which is terrifying in and of itself, but I mean that like what lengths can the medical system go to if they can be captured so easily by something that seems quite illogical?
Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about kind of cosmetic surgery more generally, like there's a lot to say about that. Like, for one thing, I think that these are just cosmetic surgeries. When we do, like, I don't think that they're medicine. For another thing, like cosmetic surgeons are meant to screen for things like body dysmorphic disorder, or basically like, okay, does the patient have unrealistic expectations for surgery? And if a patient has unrealistic expectations for surgery, that is supposed to be like a contraindication for surgery. We shouldn't do it. Transition, by definition, is an unrealistic expectation for surgery. You can get breast implants and your breast will really get bigger. It may not, save your marriage or whatever, make your pole dance. I don't know, why women are doing this, but like there are some achievable goals that are possible. But there is no combination of surgeries and drugs that you can take that are going to change your sex. And it's not even realistic to think that there are surgeries or drugs for most people that will make other people most of the time see them the way that they want to be seen. All of these expectations that are being put on cosmetic surgery and then called medicine, like they should all be huge red flags for the surgeons who are doing this. They're not.
Except everyone's just called transphobic if they've got a query.
They're calling themselves transphobic if they have any doubts in what they're doing themselves.
Yeah.
Which is
I mean, they talk about their cis privilege that they need to overcome.
Oh, no.
Well, I don't even understand that. Like, so we have a privilege if we feel like we accept our bodies as they are.
So could it... No, maybe I won't ask that question. It could be, but I'm genuinely curious. I might delete this later.
Okay.
But I'm genuinely curious if it was a trans surgeon who was like, okay, I've transitioned. I did it as an adult when I 100% knew, and I do actually feel better in my body, and I'm a surgeon. And I work with trans youth and in the gender affirming care model. If that person turned around and was like, I have concerns about where this is going, does it then get taken seriously because they are coming within that community, or do they still get shut down?
Yeah. So, I mean, there have been examples of adults who identify as trans, not like someone that I'm thinking of, you know, they're not a surgeon, they're a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and they've expressed concerns about just how many kids are coming to identify as trans, and that there's a role of like social influence, and that transition isn't going to be the right answer for all of those kids. And in the case that I'm thinking of, I mean, this person was really attacked for saying that. It's like if you have concerns, if you ask the wrong questions, there is not a magical identity that makes it okay for you to ask them. They're just not allowed in this field of medicine right now.
That's definitely what I see. Like it's hard to just fully accept the entire ideology as the truth and something that we just need to surrender and accept. And that we should just be allowing schools to teach our children that they can choose what sex they are and alter their anatomy and step in that arena without any questions or critique. Not even critique, just critically analysing and saying, well, what are the consequences here? Like, what are the negative effects? What could happen to my child if I allow them to take hormones at the age of 8?
Yeah. And why aren't we questioning why there's a push to do it so young? And I think that there are communities online who actually talk like in that community there are still people who are concerned with how this is moving. And some of the concerns even come from the point of, okay, yeah, maybe your child is trans. They fall into that extremely rare, small, low percent of people who absolutely will benefit from hormones and surgeries, etc. The issue is that if you start implementing these practices too early, before the child has fully developed. So say you have a young boy and they haven't fully developed their genitalia, the surgeon can't actually then turn, if they were, is it vaginoplasty or something, like where they create a vagina. That's not. But they create something similar, and they can't actually do it if that child has been put on hormone blockers early because they haven't fully developed, and so they don't have enough tissue down there to be able to turn it into that. And similarly, I'm sure there are other issues for women who would later transition to men. Like, it's really something that you shouldn't be looking at or even going down the lines of until they're older and fully developed, not just for their mental state. And I mean, going through surgery as a kid at any stage is bloody traumatic. And so, but you'd think that surgeons would be trying to reassure parents, we can do this. We just need to wait. And I mean, until that point, like, let's make our kids a bit more resilient. Like, look, mate, I mean, if that's where you're at, you got dealt a really hard card in life, but you'll get through, and we can support you the best way we can until it's actually safe and appropriate to go through with transition. And I just feel like that option has even been taken off the table, and it just seems
that's even transphobic.
Like, that is transphobic, but you're just looking after like the health and safety of and like your child's general well-being. So,
is there anybody in the online communities that have those views, or are critically? I think I already asked this before. Like analyzing what is going on for them, and are kind of supporting their peers in the community in that way? Or is it mostly like predominantly
pushing for that one way of being?
So I think this is related to your question. there's a lot of exploration of like other potential explanations in these communities. So someone will come on and they'll say, you know, I think I'm a boy. I don't think I'm a girl. But like, could my OCD or the fact that I was like sexually abused or that I was uncomfortable with being a lesbian, like, could these things have contributed?
Yes.
But these kinds of alternative explanations. Yeah. And it's like, yes.
If you're out there and these are the questions you have, absolutely.
Yes.
And definitely take that into
Absolutely.
consideration.
Those things would contribute. But the way that it's talked, like these are handled like other doubts where they get kind of packaged into like, they'll be explored, but within a container in which they're ultimately dismissed. So if somebody goes on and says, okay, well, I was really, I was sexually abused as a kid, and could that have contributed? Other people will respond and say things like, well, I mean, a trans person can obviously be sexually abused, and that doesn't mean that you're not transgender. They'll explore these things, but they don't allow these things to have any meaning or to have any consequence where it's like, okay, maybe you should reconsider.
It's a join us situation.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, the kind of overall dynamic is, okay, if you're questioning, then you're trans. And if you have doubts, your doubts are a sign that you're trans. Like everything is a sign.
Interesting. And do you see people in that community who have detransitioned stay in these communities, or are they pretty much, they leave and they're out and they're kind of not supported by the same people who kind of encouraged them to walk that path?
So there are a couple of different varieties of what it means to detransition. And there are certainly some people who transition and they're part of an online community and then they'll come back. I've been seeing more of this recently, and they'll say, well, I decided that this wasn't right for me, but I'm still totally trans supportive. And I'm really glad that I did this. And I went on this gender journey, and I don't regret that I look more masculine and that I had these surgeries. And they're that kind of person isn't going to get ongoing support in a trans community, but because they're upholding the whole narrative, they'll get really positive responses. But if you detransition and you have regret, or you think that you were medically harmed, or you are, kind of breaking up with the belief system that led you to believe that you were trans in the first place, you're kind of questioning all of those things, you are not going to be welcome in the communities in which you were questioning your gender in the first place. And something a lot of detransitioners mention is, like when you detransition, you lose completely that support network that you relied on.
That's so sad.
That's really
and they have
sad.
they have to build a new one.
And I just I see, I mean, having spent a lot of time in the birth world and birth communities, I actually see so many similarities there. It's like women who have hospital births and a number of things, like their birth just did not go the way they planned, but they came out with a live mom and a live baby. And so even though they feel, and they'll talk about it, and you hear women expressing their birth stories and they're like, oh, thank God for this medical intervention. Thank God for my obstetrician. Thank God. But, they'll talk about, I got a vaginal examination during a contraction and it was the most criminally painful thing I've ever experienced in my life. But thank God for the medical system that they were there. And then, I got I got induced and baby's heart rate started going down. So then I was rushed off to an emergency C-section. Thank God, because otherwise we would have been. And they justify these things that happened that, we're, here in Australia, we're going through a massive, the birth trauma. Oh my gosh. My pregnant brain is really kicking in right now.
And you expect me to pick up the pieces with my pregnant brain. There's a big kind of case with
inquiry. That's it. That's the word.
We got there.
Inquiry. So there's this massive birth trauma inquiry happening here in Australia at the moment, which is looking into obstetric violence and all of these things. And you can hear it, and obviously sometimes absolutely medically necessary, but probably in the majority of cases, absolutely not. And these women are coming out depressed and traumatized. They don't have connections with their babies. They don't, but they will gaslight themselves and be like, thank God that I got this. And then the people around them are like, but, you know, if they're upset about the journey that their birth process took them, they were hoping for a vaginal birth and ended up in an emergency C-section where where they were knocked out and weren't even awake for the process. Then they've got their family and friends surrounding them going, yeah, but look, at least you've got a healthy baby. And there's just all of this trauma in that needs to be unpacked, that needs to be heard, it needs to be felt. And your community is in this mindset of you were saved and your baby was saved.
And I think similarly with the other side of the story is if you choose to free birth next time or home birth, those people are like, you aren't irresponsible. Yeah. You are on your own with this. Yeah. I can't support you with that. So I'm guessing it's, you know.
It's like this, it
translates to the people who opt out of their transition.
Obviously not to the same degree too.
But there are very similar.
No, but I can see some of those similar dynamics where it's like, okay, what if you have an experience that doesn't fit, you know, the way that other people have decided it should go? How do you get support?
Yeah, and it's minimal. It's big.
It's always nice to just explore it and try to come from a grounded position and critically analyze what's going on instead of blindly upholding an ideology that can, you know, be potentially harmful and irreversible for our kids. And so
but I think too, there are so many mums, especially mums and parents, who are looking at what's happening. They're like, oh, something in here doesn't feel right about this. And it could be part of like your social community. They're, you know, upholding all of this and like really into it and protect. I mean, the number of times I've seen protect trans kids, and I'm like, yes, we actually need to. We need to protect.
Yeah, but it means such different things.
Yeah. And so, but yeah, it's I think it's the work that you're doing, Eliza, is just so important because it does bring a level of groundedness and logic to the conversation that I feel is really lacking, especially because, I mean, me and Chloe can talk about it and get quite emotional just thinking of it from a parent's perspective. And, you know, I know who I am and I'm grounded in myself, but now I need to guide my children
to arrive at the same destination.
Yeah. So it's, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and giving us this, incredible knowledge and sharing your work, because it is super important. I think everyone needs to listen to it and
remain open-minded.
Yeah, and just consider, I don't know, and there's probably a lot of parents who will listen to this having not thought about it, but feeling like, okay, that's why I feel uneasy about this. I'm not the only one feeling uneasy. I don't have to shut myself down or explain it away as internalized transphobia. Like there are actual legitimate concerns here, and I am valid in that. So, yes, we thank you.
All right. It was lovely to talk to you guys.
Thanks for tuning in to the Road to Wisdom podcast. To join the journey, you can follow us on Instagram at theroadtowisdom.podcast and at www.theroadtowisdompodcast.com. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. We look forward to seeing you next week with more juicy content.